Good afternoon to all of you here in the chapel, as well as those of you listening on Zoom, and of course, those of you who might watch the video after it's been posted. We're excited to jump into week 9 this week of our biblical leadership study. This week, we are looking at Elijah and the law of magnetism. So, our biblical background for this week is all of it is taken from either 1st or 2nd Kings, and I'll share those passages with you. First, we're looking at 1 Kings 16, 29 through 17, 24. So again, 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 29, going through chapter 17 and verse 24. Second, 1 Kings 18, 20 through 26. Third, 1 Kings 19, 11 through 21. Then we jump over into 2 Kings to pick up the rest of the biblical foundation. 2 Kings 1, 1 through, so 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 25. And then finally, 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 37. So let's talk a little bit then, as we do on Mondays, to introduce to you the leadership law of magnetism. So John Maxwell writes in the 21 Most Powerful Minutes in a Leader's Day about the law of magnetism. He says, effective leaders are always on the lookout for good people. Each of us carries a mental list of what kind of people we would like in our organization. Believe it or not, whom you get is not determined by what you want. It's determined by who you are. In most situations, you draw people to you who possess the same qualities that you do. And so our leadership thought for today reflects what we just shared in the introduction to the law of magnetism. So our thought for today simply says, leaders attract not whom they want, but whom they are. And perhaps the key word in that statement is the word attract. Notice I didn't say recruit, I said attract. So that's a natural thing, that leaders will naturally attract who they are rather than who they want. So now let's go into an introduction to the prophet Elijah, who I refer to as a man of fire. Elijah was the kind of person that no one was really neutral toward. You either loved him or you hated him. So there were two key people in the biblical narrative who couldn't stand Elijah. One of them just happened to be the king, Ahab, and secondly, and perhaps even more significantly, if you can imagine that, was his wife, Jezebel. Both of them hated Elijah because Elijah continuously called them out. But the people that loved God also loved Elijah. And so Ahab and Jezebel most assuredly did not love God, so they didn't like Elijah. But the people, and especially those who loved God, those were the people that loved Elijah. So you can say that Elijah had a fiery personality. Some of the key experiences in his lifetime, in fact, the two most powerful ones, involved fire. First is the showdown on Mount Carmel that's recorded in 1 Kings chapter 18. This happened with the prophets of Baal. Elijah called down fire to basically determine the winner of a contest between the prophets of Baal and himself as to which God was the real God, either Baal or Jehovah. And so Elijah proposed that the winning sacrifice be determined by fire falling from heaven and consuming whichever one sacrifice was to the real God. Then the second big event, of course, of Elijah's life was at the very end of his life, because the scripture tells us that Elijah, rather than tasting death, instead was directly taken to heaven in a chariot of fire. So Elijah was a man of fire, but he was also a man of magnetism. You see, he not only attracted followers, but he also attracted other prophets, and in particular, Elisha, who became his successor. Elisha was the prophet who asked Elijah, right before Elijah was translated to heaven, for a double portion of his spirit. Now, just as an aside, I went through the Old Testament one time because I was curious about what this double portion meant. And so I counted the number of miracles that are recorded as having been performed by Elijah, and that total came to 16. Now, take a guess as to how many miracles that's recorded as performed by Elisha. If you guess 32, double Elijah's, you are correct. In fact, the amazing thing is that the 32nd and final miracle attributed to Elisha actually happened when he was dead. Because what happened is that a dead body was thrown into Elisha's tomb, and as soon as that corpse touched the bones of Elisha, it came back to life. And so that was actually the 32nd and final miracle attributed to Elisha, which of course is twice as many exactly as attributed to Elijah. So, getting into the nuts and bolts of our lesson today, I want to talk about the truth of attraction. The law of magnetism says that who you are is who you attract. And we'll keep coming back to this point day after day. Elijah serves as living proof of this leadership law. Magnetism impacts leadership in 5 different ways as follows. First, every leader has a measure of magnetism. Second, a leader's magnetism may impact others intellectually, emotionally, or volitionally. Third, magnetism is neither good nor bad in and of itself. It depends on what a leader does with it. Fourth, all leaders draw similar followers, but secure leaders, they draw complementary followers as well. And then 5, a leader's magnetism is not static. In other words, what you have today doesn't have to be what it will always be. You can grow in it. So let's unpack these 5 points. Every leader has a measure of magnetism. Some have more than others to be true. But here's the point to make on this sub-point here. You don't have to be a charismatic, larger-than-life personality to attract followers. In fact, simply put, all leaders have followers because if they don't, well, they're not really leaders. They might have a position or a title, but they're not leaders. So every leader, including you, has a measure of magnetism. Secondly, a leader's magnetism impacts others in a variety of ways. We picked three words: intellectually, emotionally, or volitionally. And those words correspond to, of course, our mind, our emotion, or our heart, and our wills. And so, in fact, the best leaders will connect with people on all 3 of those levels. Elisha demonstrates all 3 connection points in the showdown on Mount Carmel. First, he connected intellectually by asking God to send down fire and actually making the presence of the fire the determining factor as to which God was the true God. In other words, that was an objective measure that everyone would be able to say, yes, the fire came down and consumed the sacrifice. So there would be no subjectivity to it at all, but very objective. So he appealed first to the mind. But Elijah went further than that, because as he was preparing his sacrifice, of course, this was after the prophets of Baal were quite unsuccessful after several hours, but Elijah very confidently not only sets up his altar, the stones, the wood, and the sacrifice itself, but he also called for a whole lot of water to douse the sacrifice. It was a substantial amount that there was a trench built around the altar, and the water filled up that trench. And so in that sense, I see Elijah connecting at a heart level, in that he was asking God for such an incredible miracle, and he was demonstrating such utter faith in God that everyone took notice. And of course, the fire did come, and despite the water, that had no impact at all. Not only the sacrifice was burned up, but the water that was all around the altar, that got consumed as well. And then finally, the volitional aspect was when the people, when they saw the fire fall, they just spontaneously shouted, "The Lord, he is God," which Elijah responded then by calling on the people to seize the 450 false prophets of Baal so that Elijah would execute them. And the people of Israel rounded up those false prophets, and that's what happened to them. So again, Elijah demonstrates all three of these connection points: mind, heart, and will. Third, magnetism is neither good nor bad in itself. Magnetism is like money, or maybe like charisma, in that it depends on how its possessor uses it. So looking at charisma, for example, take two leaders of the 20th century. One, Adolf Hitler. Second, Mother Teresa. Obviously, the very names evoke very different responses, because we look at one as an amazing leader who had a huge impact, whereas the other, well, we don't talk too much about him. But you see, both of them had charisma. The difference between Adolf Hitler and Mother Teresa was that Hitler used his charisma to try to take over the world, whereas Mother Teresa used hers to bring healing and hope to some of the world's most destitute people. So the same gift, but in the hands of two very different characters, produced very vastly different results. Now, Elijah, he used his influence to attract other like-minded prophets to both fulfill and extend his God-given mission. The fourth point, really important, talking about a secure leader. Like Elijah, who attracted people who loved God and were gifted in prophecy, you will tend to attract people similar to yourself. But secure leaders, those who are able to identify their weaknesses as well as their strengths, they also attract people who complement them. They are strong in areas the leader is weak in. So, for example, a big picture, visionary leader may well attract a detail-oriented person to help bring that vision to fruition. The key is that the big picture visionary leader does not feel threatened by the detail-oriented person to come alongside and help that vision come to fruition. The visionary leader, the person in greater authority, has to release the other person to be all that they can be and not feel threatened by their success. That's what we mean by secure leaders, because everyone will draw people who are similar to themselves, but secure leaders will go above and beyond drawing similar people. They will also draw people with complementary skills and abilities. Which brings us to our last point, and we want to certainly encourage you with this. A leader is not allocated a static level of magnetism. It can actually be grown and developed, much like many of the leadership principles that we have been talking about for the last 8 weeks. So let's take Elijah, for example. In Elijah's early years, he actually was quite obscure and not really well known. The bulk of his ministry prior to the showdown at Mount Carmel really focused on a mother and her son. That was until Mount Carmel. But during those obscure years, God blessed Elijah with the time that he needed to develop his vision for his life and to make his mission clear. And it's those two things that enabled Elijah to go up against 450 false prophets. Think about those odds. 1 compared to 450. And yet Elijah was so confident in his God that he knew that God would grant him victory. So you see, Elijah's magnetism grew as he grew. And so that takes us to our conclusion for today. If you will look at the people you have been attracting as a leader, you will find out a lot about yourself. What you observe may please you, but if it doesn't, if you aren't getting the kind or the number of followers you'd like, there is good news. You need not be stuck where you are. You can grow and change in this area of your leadership. And that is found in the 21 Most Powerful Minutes in a Leader's Day on page 137, of course, by John Maxwell. So I hope that you have enjoyed this introductory session to the law of magnetism. It'll be a very insightful week. And even with today's question for reflection that I'd like to share with you now, what kind of people are drawn to you? That's our reflection question for today. Again, what kind of people are drawn to you? So you would benefit by taking some time and really considering this. Maybe take not a written inventory, or maybe you might want to write down, but think in terms of the kinds of people that you have naturally attracted. Do you see any patterns? Do you see any similarities amongst the various followers, but then also look at their similarities to you? And then you can determine to what degree this law of magnetism has influenced the people that you naturally attract. And so I invite you today to think through this question: what kind of people are drawn to you? If you haven't had a chance yet to peruse the foundational passages, I encourage you to do that back in 1 Kings, and then 17, 18, and 19, and then 2 Kings chapters 1, 2, and 4, and take a look at those foundational passages. They will help really augment what we're sharing here in our time together. So with that, I very much look forward to spending this week with you, talking at greater length about the law of magnetism and the prophet Elijah, and invite you to be with us each and every day at 3:30. And of course, on Friday, we meet 2 hours earlier at 1:30. But don't worry if you can't join us live at 3:30. You can always catch the videos later. And as you know, you have two options. You can either come to the chapel here at Adena at 3:30 and be a part of the live audience, or you can certainly feel free to tune in on Zoom. And we are grateful for that tool. So we ask God's blessing on you and pray that the rest of your day go well, and ask God's blessing on your life and leadership. So thank you. God bless.